Hey everyone, this is Bennett Townsend, and I'm going to be going over the vulnerability assessment that we were assigned to do these past couple weeks. So first off, I can kind of go over my executive summary. I can make it fairly brief, but the partner that I did my scan on obviously had a Linux and Windows server, and the Linux server was running Ubuntu server uh, 20 LTS as the operating system, and it was found to have two medium vulnerabilities and one low vulnerability, while the Windows machine currently running Microsoft Server 2019 as the operating system did not have any findings. Just as an overview, the first medium vulnerability found on my partner's Linux server was a weak cipher suite, and it was being used or accepted by postfix over SMTP. So the more or less the vulnerability will be exploited or can be exploited by attackers to intercept any network traffic or brute force attacks, which could eventually lead to compromise of sensitive information. Now, the second medium vulnerability was also a weak cipher suite, but this was being used by the database PostgreSQL. And again, this vulnerability will expose a server to potential eavesdropping attacks or brute force attacks. And finally, the low vulnerability was identified again on the Linux server and was a TCP timestamp issue that could actually lead to a denial of service attack. So this assessment did not identify any vulnerabilities on the Windows machine, indicating a higher level of security for the system. Now, it is important to note that this does not necessarily mean that the Windows machine is entirely secure. So further security testing may be necessary to ensure that the server is fully protected against potential threats. Now, the Linux server does require immediate attention to address those medium vulnerabilities found in the weak cipher suites that I mentioned, both used by Postfix and PostgreSQL. And the timestamp TCP timestamp issue should also be addressed, although it is of lower priority. It's recommended, or I recommended, that appropriate security measures, such as updating the server's SSL TLS configuration and addressing the TCP timestamp issue, uh, be implemented or further implemented to mitigate these vulnerabilities and prevent potential threats or attacks. And then obviously regular assessment should be conducted to ensure the continued safety and protection of the servers. So I'm going to kind of go over in a technical sense of the summaries, um, just to kind of get a little more into it. So the conducted scan using the Greenbone scanner or vulnerability management provider, it resulted in finding some of the areas that can be improved upon to further my partner's harden or further harden my partner's virtual machine. And again, no vulnerabilities were found on the Windows machine. So again, port 465 SMTP or postfixed, it showed weak SSL TLS cipher suites. The specific cipher suite being used was TLS RSA with SSEED, SBS SHA, and it was being accepted through the TLS protocol on version 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2, all which are considered old and weak. So this cipher suite is considered weak also due to its seed encryption cipher that is not considered strong enough to protect sensitive data due to its small block size of 128 bits. It also uses an RSA key exchange, which is vulnerable to man-in-the-middle and brute force attacks, and the cipher suite does not provide forward secrecy. So if the attacker obtains the private key, all past and future sessions can be decrypted. It's also outdated and was actually deprecated in TLS 1.2 and then removed altogether from TLS 1.3. Same thing goes for the Postgre database over port 5432. Also uses the weak cipher suite TLS RSA with seed SBS SHA, all on the same TLS protocols 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, and is also considered weak due to all the reasoning I stated above. The last vulnerability, or I'm sorry, not above, previously. So the last vulnerability that was found on my Linux partner was, again, the TCP timestamp, which will allow the remote host to request uptime for machine as well as boot time. So when these times are calculated precisely, it can actually help an attacker detect hidden operating systems, spoof IP and MAC addresses, and link them together, or trigger persistent buffer socket resource exhaustion, denial of service attack. So again, the overall scan found two medium vulnerabilities, accepted weak cipher suites on port 465 and 5432, and one low vulnerability, TCP timestamps for both of um, for my partner's Linux machine, and both my partner's Windows and Linux machines had the necessary ports open and closed for this class when Nmap was conducted on the assigned IP addresses. So a couple remediations for the vulnerabilities that I noted earlier or previously in the technical summary and executive summary. So to resolve the TCP timestamps vulnerability, you must deactivate the timestamp response, which can be done by running sysctl-w net.ipv4.tcp underscore timestamps equals 0. And then execute sysctl space dash p to ensure the setting is applied at runtime. And this will ensure that there is no response if the TCP timestamps are requested. To prevent postfix from using these weak cipher suites, we must prevent the postfix from using the weak TLS protocols and force it to use TLS 1.3. This will prevent the weak cipher suites from being used because they're no longer provided in TLS 1.3. So you will have to add a few lines to postfix's configuration file, which is etc postfix main.cf, which must be opened with any text editor such as Nano. Once the configuration file is opened, you need to navigate down to pound new protocols, and under this comment, you can add the following 4 lines. I'm going to list out just a couple of them, but it's smtpd underscore tls underscore mandatory underscore protocols, and it's going to equal, and then you're going to add a exclamation point to TLS v1, which means exclude, and then you're going to do that for all the protocols. You're also going to do that for SMTP, and then you're going to do a line of SMTPD, SMPTD underscore TLS underscore protocols equals exclamation point TLS v1, and again, you're going to repeat that for all TLS protocols, so 1.1 and 1.2. And then what you'll do is you'll exit the text editor and obviously save your changes, and you can restart your postfix server with sudo systemctl restart postfix. And more or less what this will do is it will not allow TLS 1.0, 1.1, or 1.2 to be used, but will allow TLS 1.3 and any other new TLS protocols that may be considered more secure. To prevent PostgreSQL, the database, from using the weak cipher suites, we must force it to use TLS 1.3, which will prevent the weak cipher suites from being used. So this can be done by navigating to Postgres configuration file, which is etc postgre12, if that's the version you're running, main postgresql.conf, conf. And again, use whatever text editor you'd like. And once it's open, you can scroll down to the pound SSL section and find the comment pound SSL underscore min underscore protocol underscore version equals. And what you'll do is you'll uncomment this and add quote TLS v 1.3 end quote after the equal sign. So it will be SSL underscore min underscore protocol underscore version equals quote TLS v 1.3 end quote. And again, save and exit and restart the PostgreSQL server. with sudo systemctl restart PostgreSQL. This will force TLS protocol 1.3 to be used, and again, prevent those weak cipher suites from being accepted. All right, so lastly, I'm going to go over the vulnerability ranking scale. So how Greenbone ranks the vulnerabilities and what's the significance of this. So Greenbone will rank the vulnerabilities based on the severity level, which is actually calculated by the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS. And the CVSS score evaluates vulnerabilities based on various metrics. So this includes a base score metrics, temporal score metric, and a environmental score metric, where the base score metrics are actually independent of time and any IT enterprise environments and represents a more basic characteristic of the vulnerability. Whereas the temporal score metrics is a representation of how the characteristics of the vulnerability can change over time, but again remain in the same multiple IT environments. And the environmental score metrics will actually show how vulnerabilities act within a specific IT environment and how an organization would react to these vulnerabilities being exploited. So Greenbone supports CVSS version 3.0 and 3.1, which divides the severity levels more finely than version 2.0. Versions 3.0 and 3.1 divide the severity levels into 5 categories. You have none, which is 0.0, low, which is a range of 0.1 to 3.9, medium is a 4.0 to 6.9, range, high is 7.0 to 8.9 range, and critical is 9.0 to 10.0 range. So these scores are calculated based on the matrix outlined that I stated previously, but this base score matrix is typically the only score published, as it does provide the most meaningful score, as the others are a little more dependent on specific IT environments. So that is everything I have to report. Here are the references that I used to collect all this information and come to these conclusions. And again, I look forward to hearing what everyone has to say about my report, and I look forward to seeing what everyone did for theirs.